This house, to me, was once a gentle melody, one that my late husband and I composed together through 60 years of love. But then, the very children I carried and gave birth to struck a jarring chord of greed, turning the music of my life into a tragic ballad, buried for years beneath the cold basement floor. It may sound unbelievable, but this is a true story etched into every wooden beam, every brick of this place. A secret that silence could no longer keep. If you're hearing this story from anywhere in the world, leave a comment because some stories, no matter how painful, need to be told. My name is Charlotte Williams. I'm 81 years old, and I've lived in Asheville, North Carolina, ever since I was born. Known by everyone as the best baker in the region, I supported my family with the sweat of my brow and the skill of my hands for over 50 years. I've catered weddings, baptisms, birthdays, for important people, even political fundraisers. Everyone here knows Mrs. Charlotte's Cakes. A widow for 2 years, I continued on with my life and my small business in the back of the large family home that my late Robert and I built plank by plank. A house my children always coveted, especially after the downtown area started appreciating and the land around here became worth a fortune. Because what I'm about to tell sounds like a lie, but it's the pure truth, as certain as the sun that rises every day over Asheville. The truth about how my 3 children, Mark, Sarah, and Ryan, planned to get rid of me to take the house, the land, and my retirement money. I'll never forget the day I heard them talking on the porch. I was in the kitchen preparing cake batter with the window open. They didn't see me there. They thought I was in the back room, where my small bakery is. "We need to solve the old lady problem," said Mark, my eldest. "She's never going to sell this house. I've tried to convince her every which way." Sarah, always practical, replied, "If she doesn't want to go to the nursing home willingly, she'll go unwillingly. We'll find a way." It was Ryan, the youngest, who said the words that froze my blood. "People her age die all the time. No one would suspect if nature got a little push." I stood paralyzed, my hands covered in flour, listening to my own children planning my death. In that one moment, the world Charlotte knew shattered completely. A mother's worst nightmare wasn't a monster under the bed, but her own children whispering on the porch. So what happens when the people you love most become your greatest threat? Let's find out. That very same night, I confronted the 3 of them in the living room. I laid out what I had heard, foolishly hoping they would deny it, say I had misunderstood. But Mark just laughed in my face. "You're really losing it, aren't you? Hearing things. That's a sign you really do need care." Sarah feigned concern, taking my hand with false tenderness. "Mom, we just want what's best for you. This house is too big for you to take care of alone." Ryan wouldn't even look me in the eye. I went to bed uneasy, with a cup of tea that Sarah insisted I drink. "To calm your nerves," she said. Little did I know they had put a sleeping pill in my drink. It's the small acts of trust that cut the deepest when they're broken. She thought it was a cup of tea to calm her nerves, but it was the key to her cage. The night was about to get much, much darker. I woke up with a heavy head, a dry mouth, in a dark, damp place. It took me a while to realize where I was. The basement of my own house, a cubbyhole we hardly ever used, full of old junk, with a small door leading to a tiny, old-fashioned bathroom. There was a rusty faucet, a toilet yellowed by time, and that was it. The stone walls were cold and damp, and the only light came from a dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. The door leading to the kitchen stairs was locked from the outside. I screamed. I banged. I begged. No one came. Or rather, they did come. I heard footsteps upstairs, laughter, the sound of clinking glasses. They were celebrating. It was Mark who finally appeared, opening the door just a crack with a smile I had never seen on his face. A malicious smile of someone enjoying another's suffering. "You're going to stay here until we decide what to do. If you cooperate and sign the house transfer, maybe we'll take you to the nursing home. If not," he left the sentence hanging in the air, but the meaning was crystal clear. I rebelled, of course. I screamed that it was absurd, that it was my house, that they couldn't do this. He just laughed again. "Who's going to miss you, Mom? Everyone knows you're a bit off your rocker. We'll say you ran away, that you were confused. After a while, we'll file a missing persons report. Life goes on. I was left there, stunned, unable to believe what was happening. My own children, whom I carried in my womb, whom I fed with my own milk, whom I raised with so much sacrifice, were now treating me like an animal. Worse, like a nuisance that needed to be eliminated. The first day was one of desperation. I screamed until I lost my voice. I banged on the door until my hands were bruised. I cried, I pleaded, I threatened. Nothing worked. At some point, a smell hit me like a stab wound. The aroma of pot roast, of buttered rice, of simmering pinto beans. They were cooking upstairs, and the smell drifted down through the cracks, reminding me that while I was down here with nothing, they were enjoying life, eating well, drinking, laughing. My stomach growled in protest. It had been almost 24 hours since I'd had a single bite. The second day was even worse. Hunger began to consume me from the inside, like an animal gnawing at my entrails. The thirst was desperate, and I only had the rusty water from the small bathroom faucet to quench it. The water tasted of rust and dirt, but it was that or nothing. From time to time, I heard footsteps upstairs. I recognized Mark's heavy tread, Sarah's heels clicking on the floorboards, Ryan's shuffling feet. My own flesh and blood, leaving me there to die slowly. At night, I heard music, laughter, the clinking of silverware. They were having a party, from the sound of the voices. Who were the guests? What had they said about my disappearance? How many lies did they tell to justify my absence? The cruelty wasn't just in leaving me without food, but in throwing a party while I wasted away beneath their feet. But there was a hunger worse than the one in my stomach. It was the hunger of the soul. Down there, in the damp darkness, I wasn't just Charlotte Williams, the baker, the mother, the widow. I was nothing, a forgotten object. They were not just starving my body. They were trying to erase my existence, my story, my very name from the world. For a moment, a terrifying thought crept in. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a nuisance, an old woman who had outlived her purpose. The despair was a cold, heavy blanket, threatening to smother the last spark of fight I had left. On the third day, weakness began to take over. My legs could barely support me, and I spent most of the time lying on an old mattress that was down there. My stomach no longer growled. It had passed the point of painful hunger to the hunger that numbs. My head spun if I tried to get up too quickly. Occasionally, I'd hear Sarah's voice talking to someone on the phone, speaking just outside the door. Not yet, stubborn old woman. She's lasting longer than we expected. Or Ryan, nervously. What if someone asks about her? The neighbor, Betty, has already come by twice. Mark always answered with authority. I already took care of it. I said she went to visit a sick cousin in Charlotte. No one will suspect. And I started marking the days, scratching with a piece of charcoal I found on the basement floor. A little line on the wall for each dawn I could count through the cracks of the tiny window that looked out onto the backyard. When I no longer had the strength to scream or bang on the door, I started to think. To think about how I had gotten there, where I had gone wrong in raising these three. I remembered the times Mark, as a boy, would torture stray animals. Sarah's lies as a teenager, always manipulating situations to her advantage. Ryan, who never looked you in the eye when he spoke, always hiding something. The signs were there, and I didn't want to see them. A mother's love blinded me. But now, in the darkness of that basement, I saw clearly what they really were. On the fourth day, the hallucinations began. I saw Robert sitting in the corner of the basement, calling to me with that gentle smile he always had. Not yet, old man, I'd reply, even though I knew it was all in my head. I have things to take care of before I go with you. I also saw my mother, who passed away more than 40 years ago, braiding her hair on an imaginary stool. She hummed a lullaby she used to sing to me in my childhood. I could even smell her scent, lavender and fresh coffee. The mind plays these tricks when the body is too weak. But amidst the visions, a certainty grew within me. I was not going to die there. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. I was not going to be buried like a dirty secret in the backyard. If I had survived the drought of 2054, the flood of 2066, the stroke of 2010, I would survive this betrayal too. The fifth day, was when anger replaced despair. This is the moment the story turns. Despair can break you, or it can be forged into a weapon, and Charlotte just found her steel. They wanted to bury a victim, but they were about to unleash a survivor. A cold, calculating anger that gave me strength when I thought I had none left. I began to plan. There had to be a way out of there. The basement was old, from when the house was built over 50 years ago. I remembered that there used to be an external entrance that led to the yard, used to store food back when there were no refrigerators. My Robert had sealed that entrance with bricks when we renovated the house back in the 82nd. But the bricks must still be there, behind some old junk, if I could find that exit. But I was too weak to search. Every movement was a monumental effort. The world spun around me when I stood up. Hunger was no longer a sensation. It was me. It had become my essence. The smell of food coming from upstairs was a constant torture. That day, they made North Carolina barbecue. I recognized the unmistakable aroma of smoked pork, the tangy sauce, the beans cooking slowly. It was the recipe I myself had taught Sarah. They not only imprisoned me, but they used my own recipes to feed themselves while they starved me to death. Cruelty has many layers, and this, perhaps, was the most painful. On the 6th day, hope came in the form of a sound, a scratching at the door. I thought it was another hallucination, but the sound continued, insistent. I dragged myself over and heard a faint meow. It was Whiskers, a stray cat I had been feeding for years. Somehow, he had gotten into the house and sniffed out my presence. They say God has many ways of sending a message. Maybe that day, he sent me a little angel with whiskers and 4 paws. Maybe he was trying to tell me, "Charlotte, you're not done here yet. Don't give up." "Whiskers," I called with a weak voice. The meowing grew more urgent. I stuck my fingers through the crack under the door, feeling the cat's soft fur. He licked my fingers, just as he always did when I fed him. The irony did not escape me. I, who had fed so many, including this stray cat, was now dying of hunger while he roamed freely. But Whiskers brought more than momentary comfort. He brought an idea. If he could get in and out of the house, it meant there was a passage. But Whiskers brought more than momentary comfort. He brought a profound lesson. Here was this simple creature, bound to me by nothing more than a few saucers of milk, showing me a loyalty my own flesh and blood could not comprehend. His persistent meow wasn't just a cry for food. It was a call to life, a refusal to let me disappear into the silence. He reminded me that I was still connected to the world above. He brought an idea, yes, but more importantly, he reignited my hope. It's amazing how hope can arrive on 4 paws, isn't it? A simple stray cat showed more loyalty than her own flesh and blood, reminding her she wasn't forgotten. And with that tiny spark, a plan for justice begins to form. Perhaps the old basement entrance wasn't as well sealed as we thought. With energy renewed by hope, I began to examine the basement walls, feeling every inch in the dark. It was hard to see. The only light came from the dim bulb on the ceiling and the tiny crack of the window, but I didn't need to see. I knew that house like the back of my hand. I moved old boxes, broken furniture, junk accumulated over decades. In an area behind an old cabinet, I felt a difference in the wall's texture. It wasn't the cold stone of the other walls, but bricks. Bricks that, when pressed hard, seemed to give way a little. There it was, the old entrance, blocked as I remembered, but perhaps not as solidly as it should have been. On the 7th day, I heard a heated argument upstairs. Mark sounded nervous. This should have been over by now. How much longer is this going to take? Sarah replied irritably. And what do you want to do? Go down there and finish the job? Don't be stupid. This way leaves no trace. It looks like natural causes. Ryan, always the most fearful, whined. What if someone finds out? We'll go to jail. Shut up, Mark ordered. No one's going to find out. A few more days, and it's settled. Then we clean everything up down there. Say she ran away, confused. Wait a while, and declare her missing. When they find the body, it'll look like she got lost and died of natural causes. Natural causes. That's how they planned to justify my murder. The conversation gave me even more determination. I wasn't going to be anyone's body. I was going to get out of there and make them pay for every minute of suffering. On the 8th day, I could barely stay conscious. The weakness was so profound that the simple act of breathing seemed to require a monumental effort. My lips were cracked, my tongue swollen. The rusty tap water barely relieved the constant thirst. The pain in my stomach had stopped, a dangerous silence that indicated the body was beginning to consume itself. The hallucinations returned, more intense. I saw non-existent people walking through the basement. I heard voices calling my name. In a moment of lucidity, I dragged myself to the brick wall I had discovered and, gathering strength I didn't know I still had, I began to scrape the cement between the bricks with an old spoon I found among the junk. The cement was worn by time, fragile. With immense effort, I managed to loosen one brick, then another. A small opening began to form. On the other side, I saw a piece of the yard, the sunlight, freedom. But the opening was still too small, and I was too weak. 10 days without a crumb of food, only with rusty tap water from the bathroom. And still, it wasn't enough to destroy me. Every time I thought I was going to give up, that I would let the darkness take me, I thought of their faces, celebrating my death, of the house I built with so much sweat being taken over, of the injustice of it all. And I found one last thread of strength to continue, because my mother always used to say, "Charlotte, you were born on a stormy day with the cord wrapped around your neck, and yet you survived. You came into this world to be strong, and strong I would be, until my last breath, not for myself, but for the justice I deserved, for the lesson I needed to teach, for the dinner I was yet to serve. But hold on, before I go straight to the end, I have to start this story from the very beginning of my life. For you to understand how I got into that situation, tied up by my own flesh and blood in a dark basement, I need to go back in time. I wasn't born yesterday, or the day before. I came into the world in 1944, in the same house where I almost died, a house that wasn't even really a house when I was born. It was a small, 3-room shack on what was then the edge of Asheville. My father, George, worked at the lumber mill. My mother, Clara, did laundry for others and sold some fudge she made with brown sugar and pecans. It was with her that I learned the trade that would sustain me my whole life. Ever since I was a little girl, I would watch my mom stir the pot of sweets. "Keep a sharp eye, Charlotte," she would say. "Candy is like a man. If you don't pay attention, it'll trick you." By age 8, I already knew how to make a pumpkin fudge that melted in your mouth. At 12, I started selling my own candies at the school gate. The little bit of money helped at home, where there was never any extra. I only studied until the 4th grade. Back then, poor girls didn't go far in their studies, but I learned what was important: to read, to write, to do arithmetic, and most importantly, to work with my hands. Mom always said, "Charlotte, as long as you have your hands and your head on straight, you'll never be in need." I met my Robert when I was 17 at a church potluck. He worked at the textile mill. He was a good man from a simple family like mine. We dated for 2 years. We got married in 1963. I was 19. He was 23. Our first home was a rented room in the back of a store. That's where Mark was born, in 1964. Sarah came 2 years later, and Ryan in 1970. 3 children, a cramped little room, and the dream of having our own place. Robert worked from sunup to sundown, did odd jobs on the weekends, saved every penny. I was right there with him. Besides taking care of the children, I made sweets to sell. First, just to the neighbors, then for a few parties, until word of mouth made my fame grow in the city. In 1972, we managed to buy a small piece of land at the entrance of what is now the downtown area. Back then, it was a simple area of working-class people. With the help of some friends, Robert built a small house with 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a kitchen. In the back of the property, we made a small room that would be my little candy factory. I remember the day we moved in, the children running around the large yard, Robert and I looking at each other, hardly believing it was all ours. That's where the good part of our lives began. The house grew along with the city. Every year we saved money and added a little something. An extra room, a porch, a better bathroom. The basement came when we needed a place to store supplies. In Asheville, it gets warm, and without a proper refrigerator, it was hard to preserve ingredients. The sweets business prospered along with the family. Soon, it wasn't just me anymore. I hired 2 helpers, then 3 more. The orders never stopped coming. Mrs. Charlotte's Sweets became a benchmark in the region. I made everything: coconut cream pie, fudge, pecan pie, peanut brittle, bread pudding, lemon meringue pie, pound cake. But what really made me famous was the apple stack cake with cinnamon and cloves. My mother's recipe with a little touch of my own that I never revealed to anyone. Even wealthy people from Asheville society insisted on my desserts at their parties. Can you believe it? Me, the daughter of a lumber mill worker, with hands calloused from so much work, being sought after by the city's elite. Mark, my eldest, was always a difficult child. Since he was little, he wanted the best of everything. He saw his classmates with new toys, brand-name clothes, and he would be consumed with envy. "Mom, why aren't we rich?" he would ask with a scowl. I would explain that we were rich, yes, in health, in family, in love. But that didn't satisfy Mark. In his teens, he started causing trouble. He didn't want to study, only wanted to party. Robert was hard on him, and the two were always fighting. Even so, we never stopped supporting him. We paid for vocational school, then college for business administration, which he dropped out of in his 2nd year. "It's not for me, Mom," he'd say. "I'll make my own way." The other way always involved our money. Sarah was different, studious, intelligent, determined. She graduated in accounting, got a good job at the city bank. I thought that, at least with her, I could rest easy. But the husband she found, Dennis, was a piece of trash. He drank, gambled, and worst of all, he hit her. She endured 5 years of marriage until one day she showed up at our door with a black eye and a suitcase. "It's over, Mom," was all she said. She moved back in with us, but she was never the same. Bitter, distrustful, with a manipulative streak that grew over time. She quit her job at the bank, saying her ex-husband was always causing problems for her there. She started helping with the sweets business, but in reality, it was more me helping her financially than the other way around. My youngest, Ryan, gave me the most hope and then the most disappointment. A sensitive boy, he liked to draw, to read, to tell stories. He had a gentle way with animals, with plants. I thought he would be a teacher, an artist, something like that. But in his teens, he started hanging out with a bad crowd. He experimented with drugs, alcohol. He tried college 3 times, never made it past the first year. He was always in and out of jobs, salesman, waiter, administrative assistant. Nothing lasted more than a few months. He would always come back home with his head down and his hand out. "Just until I get back on my feet, Mom," was what he'd say. That getting back on his feet never came. Robert and I worked hard our whole lives to provide for and give opportunities to the 3 of them. It wasn't luxury, but there was never a lack of food on the table, clean clothes, a safe roof over their heads. We managed to expand the house little by little until it became what it is today. A large, old, but well-maintained building with 5 bedrooms, a spacious living room, a large kitchen, my small factory in the back, and a piece of land that, with the city's growth, became worth a small fortune. Not that we cared about that. It was our home, the place where we raised our family, where we had our memories. It never crossed our minds to sell, even when tempting offers started to appear. My Robert passed away 2 years ago. A massive heart attack took my partner of 60 years on a Sunday morning. We were having coffee on the porch, as we did every Sunday, when he simply said, "I'm feeling strange, Charlotte," and slumped forward. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing to be done. He was buried in the same cemetery where my parents are, with the whole town attending the wake. He was a beloved man, my Robert, honest, hard-working, respected, Mr. Charlotte's Sweets. They called him on the street, even though he'd never made a sweet in his life. He was the baker's husband, and that was a source of pride for him. Robert's death changed everything. Not just because of the void it left in my life, 58 years sleeping next to a person, and suddenly the bed is half empty, but because it awakened something in my children that I had never seen before. Or maybe it was always there, hidden. and I didn't want to see it. Greed, self-interest, the thirst to possess what they did not build. Right after the funeral, Mark showed up with a realtor friend wanting to appraise the house. "It's just to get an idea, Mom. You don't need this huge house all by yourself." Sarah started talking about some luxury nursing home that had opened in Charlotte. "It's practically a 5-star hotel, Mom. You would love it. They even have a beauty salon." Ryan, always the most direct, asked point blank, "Has the insurance money from Dad come through yet?" There was no insurance. Robert and I never worried about those things. What we had was right there: the house, the land, the small sweets business, which even at my age, I still ran with the help of 2 employees. I also had a modest savings account for emergencies, and my Social Security, which wasn't much, but covered the basics, enough for an old woman to live her final years with dignity. But it wasn't enough for my children, who suddenly discovered that the land downtown was worth a few million, that the old house could be replaced by an apartment building, that the sweets business had a loyal clientele that could be exploited in other ways. At first, it was just suggestions, seemingly innocent comments. "Mom, have you ever thought about selling the house and buying a smaller apartment? You'd have a good amount of money left over." Or, "This neighborhood is getting dangerous. It's not a place for you to live alone. And also, you've worked your whole life. You deserve to rest. Why don't you sell the sweets business?" I always gave the same answer. "I'm fine here. This is my house, my life. I don't want to move." The insistence grew, turning into pressure. Mark would bring realtors over without telling me. Sarah spread rumors in the neighborhood that I was getting forgetful, confused. Ryan would rummage through drawers, looking for documents, deeds. That's when I started to realize something was very wrong. I noticed objects moving, documents disappearing and reappearing in different places, medications I didn't remember taking. Once I woke up so dizzy I could barely get out of bed. Later, I found a dissolved pill at the bottom of the teacup Sarah had given me the night before. I started making my own food, locking my bedroom door at night, hiding my important documents. I began to distrust my own children, a feeling no mother should ever have to feel. The turning point came when Mark showed up with some papers for me to sign. "It's just a power of attorney, Mom, so we can handle some things at the bank for you." I asked to read the documents first. He grew impatient. "Do you need all that? You can barely see straight. You'll just be racking your brain for nothing." I insisted. And when I read it, I realized it wasn't a simple power of attorney. It was a transfer of property, ceding the house and the land to the 3 children, leaving me only with the right to lifelong use. In other words, the house would no longer be mine. I could only continue to live there as long as I was alive. And knowing my children as I did, I suspected that as long as I was alive could be a very short period. I refused to sign, of course. Mark was furious, like I'd never seen him. He slammed the table, yelled, called me a stubborn old woman, an ingrate. "We just want to help, and you make everything difficult." Sarah tried to play the role of conciliator with that syrupy manner of hers. "Mom, Mark is just upset because he's worried about you. We just want to make sure everything is organized." Ryan wouldn't even look me in the eye, huddled in a corner of the room. He was always the weakest of the 3, always following what his older siblings said. After that episode, things got worse quickly. The 3 of them practically moved into my house, saying they were worried about me. In reality, they were watching me, controlling who I saw, who I spoke to. My life, which had already become lonelier after Robert's departure, turned into a kind of prison. I couldn't go out alone anymore. One of them always accompanied me in case I felt ill on the street. "My employees at the bakery were dismissed to cut costs," said Sarah, who took over the business administration without consulting me. "My cell phone disappeared." "You don't need this. You only get spam calls," Mark justified. The landline only worked for calls they made or received. Little by little, I was being isolated from the world, like a plant they were letting slowly wither. It was on a stuffy July afternoon that everything culminated. I was in the kitchen preparing cake batter, one of the few activities they still allowed me to do. The kitchen window was open because of the heat and looked out onto the side porch where the 3 of them were talking, thinking I couldn't hear. "She's never going to sign," Mark said, exasperated. "She's more lucid than we thought." Sarah replied with that calculating voice. There's Plan B, the nursing home in Charlotte. I already spoke with them. They'll accept her even without her authorization, as long as we present a medical report of incapacity. That's when Ryan said the phrase that chilled my blood. What if we skip straight to Plan C, the one Mark mentioned last week? There was a heavy silence, and then Mark spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. It's risky. It has to look natural. Sarah, always practical. If we're going to do it, it has to be soon. The more time passes, the more people will notice how we're controlling her life. Betty from the diner has already asked twice why Mrs. Charlotte doesn't come by anymore. Another silence, and then Ryan, with a voice trembling slightly. How would we do it? Mark answered so quietly I had to strain to hear. The basement. We lock her down there. No food, just water. At her age, she shouldn't last more than 3-4 days. Then we say she wandered off, disoriented. Wait a while, declare her missing, and that's it. I dropped the spoon I was holding. The noise must have alerted them because the conversation stopped abruptly. I stood there paralyzed, my hands covered in cake batter, my heart beating so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My own children, planning my death. The daughter I breastfed, the sons I rocked in my arms, for whom I sacrificed my dreams, my time, my youth. Now they wanted to erase me, like someone turns off an unwanted light, a nuisance, an obstacle between them and the money they coveted. That very night, I confronted the three of them in the living room. I put my cards on the table, said everything I had heard. I expected, foolishly, that they would deny it, that they would be horrified by the mere suggestion, that they would say I had misunderstood, that it was a misunderstanding, that they would never do such a thing to their own mother. But that's not what happened. Mark, always the most direct, just shrugged. You're imagining things. It must be age affecting your mind. Sarah feigned concern with that false expression I already knew so well. Mom, that's absurd. We just want what's best for you. I think you need to rest. You're very upset. Ryan couldn't even look me in the eye, staring at the floor as he did when he was a boy after breaking something. I went to my room, locking the door, as I had been doing for the past few weeks. I sat on the bed, my hands trembling. What could I do? Call the police and say what? That my children were conspiring against me? Without concrete proof, it would be the word of an 81-year-old woman against 3 adults worried about their elderly mother. I thought about running away, going to a friend's house. But where? Most of my friends had already passed on, and the few who remained were in situations similar to mine, dependent on children or grandchildren with limited mobility. Besides, I had no access to the money in my savings account. Mark had taken control of the accounts after Robert's death to make things easier. I was mulling over these ideas when Sarah knocked on the door. Mom, I brought you some tea. It will help you calm down and sleep better. I opened the door a crack, suspicious. She was smiling, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I took the cup, but as soon as she left, I poured the contents into a plant in the hallway. I wasn't going to drink anything that came from their hands, not after what I had heard. I pretended to be asleep when she came back to get the empty cup. I heard her footsteps retreating, whispers in the hallway. They were waiting for the medicine to take effect. I must have dozed off at some point, exhausted by the stress and my age. I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door opening. Even though I had locked it, they had the spare key. Still groggy from sleep, I saw the 3 of them enter. Mark grabbed me by the arms, Ryan by the feet. I tried to scream, but Sarah covered my mouth with a cloth. There's no use resisting, Mom. It's for your own good. They carried me downstairs to the basement. I fought as much as I could. But what can an 81-year-old woman do against 3 determined adults? They threw me onto the cold basement floor, and before I could get up, the heavy door slammed shut, and I heard the key turn in the lock. You can't do this, I screamed, banging on the door with my fists. I'm your mother. I gave my life for you. On the other side, only silence. Then footsteps moving away. I was left there in the dark, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode. The only light came from a dim bulb in the ceiling, one of those old yellowish ones. The basement smelled of mold and dampness. It hadn't been used in years, except to store old junk. A threadbare mattress had been thrown in a corner. Apparently, they had planned everything in advance. There was a small bathroom, no more than a cubicle with a toilet and an old sink. The faucet dripped, a constant sound that echoed off the stone walls. I let myself fall onto the mattress, my legs weak from shock and fear. I couldn't believe what was happening. It was like a nightmare, the kind you wake up from in a cold sweat, and thank God it wasn't real. But it was real as the cold walls around me, as the darkness that enveloped me, as the hunger that was already beginning to set in. I hadn't eaten dinner that night, too nervous from the confrontation. My own children, whom I carried in my womb, whom I fed with my own milk, whom I raised with so much love and sacrifice, now locked me in a basement to let me die slowly. I cried until I had no more tears. I screamed until my voice failed. I banged on the door until my hands hurt. No one came. At some point, exhausted, I fell asleep on the hard mattress. I woke up to the sound of footsteps upstairs. It was morning. I could tell by the sliver of light coming through a tiny window near the ceiling. I heard voices, laughter. They were having breakfast, talking normally, as if they hadn't locked their own mother in the basement to starve to death. The cruelty of the situation was so absurd it seemed unreal, like something out of a horror movie. On that first day, I still had hope that they would reconsider, that the weight on their conscience would be too great, that one of them, maybe Ryan, always the most sensitive, wouldn't be able to stand it and would come to free me. I called for them several times, trying to sound calm, reasonable. "Children, let's talk. This isn't right. Get me out of here, and we'll sort everything out." No one answered, just silence, and occasionally the sound of footsteps upstairs, life going on as normal while mine was suspended in that dark hole. And so began the 10 longest and most terrible days of my life. 10 days in which I discovered the true meaning of hunger, of thirst, of despair. 10 days in which I fought tooth and nail for survival, while listening to my own children living normally upstairs, sometimes even throwing parties, as if I no longer existed. 10 days that transformed me from a loving mother into a woman determined to survive to see justice done. One thing I promised myself in that dark basement: if I got out of there alive, my children would learn a lesson they would never forget. A lesson served at the dinner table. The first day in the basement was one of pure rebellion. I paced back and forth in that damp space, screaming, banging on the door, cursing. Hunger wasn't the worst of it yet. The indignation burned stronger than any physical pain. How could they do this to me? I, who had spent sleepless nights when they were sick, who had worked until my hands bled to give them what they needed, who had given up my own dreams to fulfill theirs. At some point, I heard the clatter of cutlery and plates from upstairs. They were having lunch. The smell of beans with bacon, my recipe that I had taught Sarah, wafted down through the cracks in the ceiling, filling the basement. My stomach rumbled in protest. That familiar smell, which had so often meant comfort and family gatherings, was now a form of torture. At night, I heard footsteps approaching the basement door. I became alert, my heart racing. Was it one of them coming to let me out? Had it been a lesson, a scare to make me agree to sell the house? The key turned in the lock, and the door opened a crack. It was Mark. "I brought water," he said, pushing a plastic bottle through the gap. His voice had new emotion, as if he were talking to an animal, not the woman who had given birth to him. "Please, son," I begged. "Let me out. This isn't right. I'm your mother." He hesitated for a second, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt? Guilt? Humanity? But then his face hardened again. "It's better this way, Mom. Quicker, less suffering. The house has to be sold. It's for the best for everyone." The door closed before I could say anything more, the key turning in the lock again. I picked up the water bottle with trembling hands. At least they weren't going to let me die of thirst. Hunger would be enough. The second day brought the first real bite of hunger. It wasn't just a rumbling stomach. It was a sensation that rose up my throat, went down my legs, an emptiness that seemed to suck at my insides. I tried to distract myself by examining the basement more carefully. It was a rectangular room, about 1, 2 by 20 feet, with stone and old brick walls. The ceiling was low, with dark wooden beams that must have been over half a century old. Besides the old mattress where I had slept, there were some dusty boxes in a corner filled with old trinkets, photo albums, Christmas ornaments, the boys' broken toys, memories of a family life that seemed increasingly like a distant dream. The little bathroom was just a cubicle, with a lidless toilet and a cracked sink. The faucet dripped constantly, a sound that started to drive me crazy after a few hours. The water came out yellowish, tasting of rust. I drank just enough to not dehydrate, rinsing my mouth several times before swallowing. On that day, I realized they had a routine upstairs. In the morning, I'd hear the sound of coffee being made, the smell of toast. In the afternoon, conversations in the living room, the sound of the television. At night, more noise, sometimes music. They lived normally, as if I didn't exist, or rather, as if I were already dead. In the evening, Mark appeared again with another bottle of water. This time he didn't say anything, just pushed the bottle through the crack and quickly closed the door. I realized this would be the routine. Water once a day, no food, no words of comfort, a calculated plan to kill me slowly, without leaving a mark. On the third day, my legs no longer obeyed me properly. I would try to stand and would stagger as if drunk. The weakness wasn't gradual. It came in waves, leaving me dizzy, disoriented. My stomach no longer rumbled. It had passed the point of hunger that makes noise to the silent hunger, the one that consumes from within without fanfare. My mouth was dry despite the water I drank, my tongue rough as sandpaper. That's when I started having the first memory lapses. I'd find myself staring into space, not knowing how much time had passed. Sometimes I thought I heard Robert's voice calling me, only to realize it was just the creaking of the floorboards upstairs. The mind plays tricks when the body is weak. Outside, life went on. I heard their voices, normal conversations about bills, about the weather, about the evening news. At some point that day, I heard the phone ring several times. Then, Mark's voice making up excuses. "No, Mom isn't here. She went to visit a cousin in Charlotte. I don't know when she'll be back." I was being erased, not only physically, but also from people's memories. Soon I would be just a memory. An elderly lady who once made the best sweets in town and then mysteriously disappeared. The fourth day was when the pain really began. It wasn't just hunger, it was a pain that seemed to come from inside my bones, as if they were being slowly crushed. Every movement was agony, even breathing hurt. My body was beginning to consume itself, desperately seeking energy where there was none. The muscles, the fat, everything being devoured from within. I tried to eat a piece of the mattress, chewing on the old foam, but it was impossible to swallow. I sucked water from the tap until my stomach ached, trying to trick it, to make it think there was something in the emptiness. It didn't work. Hunger was a constant presence, an invisible monster devouring me from the inside while I still breathed. That day, I heard Sarah talking on the phone with someone about the sweets business. "Yes, the shop is temporarily closed. Mrs. Charlotte had to be away for health reasons." I had a fit of rage hearing this. My business, built with decades of work, being dismantled while I was still alive. I banged on the door with the little strength I had. I screamed. I cursed. No one appeared. Only the sound of the television volume increased, drowning out my cries. At some point, exhausted, I fell onto the mattress and fell asleep. I dreamed of food, bountiful tables, bubbling pots, the smell of the tomato sauce my mother used to make. I woke up with my mouth full of water and my stomach contracting in painful spasms. The fifth day brought the first real hallucinations. They weren't just dreams or memory lapses, they were visions that appeared even with my eyes open. I saw my mother sitting in a corner of the basement, knitting calmly as she did when I was a child. I saw Robert leaning against the wall, looking at me with that serene way of his. "It's not time yet, Charlotte," he would say. "You still have things to resolve here." I knew they weren't real, but I talked to them anyway. It was a comfort in the midst of that horror. My mother's voice, even though it was just a product of my starving mind, calmed me. You were always strong, girl, stronger than all of them put together. That night, there was a party upstairs. I heard music, laughter, the clinking of glasses, more people than just my children. Maybe friends, maybe the buyers interested in the house. The smell of food was so strong I could almost taste it. Pot, roast, rice, beans. The sounds of celebration were like stabs. They were celebrating while I died slowly beneath their feet. I cried myself to sleep, the tears drying quickly on my thin face. My body wasn't even producing tears properly anymore. On the 6th day, I could barely get up from the mattress. I would drag myself to the bathroom when necessary, the journey of a few feet feeling like a marathon. The world spun around me, the basement walls dancing as if they were alive. My skin was stuck to my bones, my ribs prominent under the dress that now seemed several sizes too big. The daily bottle of water always appeared, pushed through the crack in the door. Sometimes it was Mark, sometimes Sarah. Ryan never appeared. Maybe he didn't have the stomach to see what they were doing to me. That day, I tried to plead with Sarah again. "Daughter, for the love of God, don't let this happen. I'm your mother." She hesitated, looking disturbed for a moment. "It's better this way, Mom. We didn't want it to come to this, but you gave us no choice. It was the house, or this." The door closed, taking with it my last hope that any of them still had a shred of humanity. The 7th day was the worst, the lowest point. I woke up not knowing where I was, who I was. Consciousness came and went like waves, leaving me disoriented. The hallucinations were constant. Now I saw people who didn't exist walking through the basement. I heard voices calling my name. My body no longer seemed to belong to me. My hands trembled nonstop, my skin dry and scaly like old paper. The pain in my bones had given way to a frightening numbness. I knew, in a still, lucid corner of my mind, that I was dying, that I wouldn't last much longer, that soon my body would give out and they would have what they wanted. The old woman eliminated, the path clear for the inheritance. It was in that moment of total despair that something inside me changed. It wasn't a flash of light, a sudden revelation, but a cold resolution that grew slowly. I was not going to die there. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. I was not going to let 3 ingrates that I had raised with so much love determine my end. If I had survived the drought of 2054, when I saw strong people fall around me, if I had survived the loss of a baby in the 62nd, if I had endured a gallbladder operation without anesthesia because the country doctor didn't have the right equipment, if I had buried my Robert without losing the will to live, then I was going to survive this too. Not for myself, but for justice, so they would not get away with it. So they would learn that some betrayals have a price. "You don't know who you're messing with," I muttered to the empty basement, my voice hoarse from thirst and disuse. This is not how Charlotte Williams ends. With this new purpose, I began to examine the basement again with new eyes. No longer as a prison from which there was no escape, but as a challenge I needed to overcome. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way. The 8th day brought a strange clarity, despite the physical weakness that only increased. It was as if my mind had separated from my body, operating on a different level. I began to reason coldly, planning each movement to expend the minimum amount of energy. I remembered that this basement had been built in the 62nd when we bought the house. At the time, there was no internal staircase. The entrance was from the outside, a small door that led to the yard, used for storing supplies. When we renovated the house in the 82nd, Robert closed this entrance with bricks and built the internal staircase that connected to the kitchen. But the bricks must still be there, behind some of that old junk. With immense effort, I began to drag the boxes and broken furniture that were leaning against the walls. Each movement was agony, my body protesting, wanting to give up, but my determination was greater than the pain. Between pauses to catch my breath, I examined every inch of the stone walls, looking for any difference in texture, any sign of the old entrance. After hours of searching, almost giving up, I found it. In a far corner behind an old cabinet, the wall was different. Not stone, but bricks. Bricks that, when pressed hard, seemed to give way a little. The 9th day was one of discovery and renewed hope. Now that I had located the old entrance, I needed to find a way to break through. The bricks were old, the cement between them deteriorated by time and humidity. With a rusty spoon I found among the junk, I began to scrape the cement joints. It was slow, exhausting work that made my arms tremble with effort. But every little piece of cement that fell was a victory, a step closer to freedom. I worked all day, stopping only when I heard footsteps upstairs, near the basement door. I didn't want them to suspect anything. At the usual time, Mark appeared with the bottle of water. I pretended to be lying on the mattress, almost unconscious. He barely glanced inside before closing the door again. Perfect. They thought I was on my last legs, that I was no longer a threat. As soon as the footsteps faded, I went back to work, ignoring the pain in my fingers, which were raw from scraping the hard cement. By the end of that day, I had managed to loosen the first brick. The feeling was indescribable, a mixture of triumph and fear. What if there was no exit on the other side? What if they had built something in front of the old entrance? I pushed the brick with the little strength I had, and it gave way, falling to the other side with a dull thud. I stuck my hand through the opening, feeling the cool night air. There was space. On the other side was the yard, as I remembered. But the opening was still too small for me to pass through, and I was too weak to continue working. I put the brick back in place, disguising the opening as best I could. Tomorrow, I would continue, with energy renewed by hope. On the 10th day, I woke with an iron determination. It would be the day of my liberation, or I would die trying. I wouldn't last much longer without food. My body was at its limit, functioning only on willpower. I worked meticulously, removing more bricks, widening the opening. Each movement was calculated to expend the least amount of energy possible. Sweat ran down my gaunt face, despite the cold of the basement. My fingers bled from the effort, but the pain was a small price to pay for freedom. It's not just an empty stomach. It's every cell in your body begging for sustenance. It's the mind starting to fray at the edges. It's the despair that comes when you realize you are dying slowly and no one is coming to save you. At noon, I heard a commotion upstairs. Raised voices, the sound of things being dragged. It seemed like they were moving something. Of course, they had probably already decided what to do with the house. Maybe they had even closed a deal with a buyer. They wasted no time. This only increased my urgency. I worked even faster, ignoring the pain, the weakness, the dizziness. The opening was now almost large enough for me to pass through. Only 2 bricks left. When I finally removed the last necessary brick, the opening was the size of a small window. I would have to squeeze through, but it was possible. On the other side, I could see a piece of the yard, the blue sky, freedom. I waited until late afternoon, when the noises upstairs indicated they were busy with dinner. I couldn't risk being seen escaping. As the sun set, the light faded, creating perfect shadows for my escape. It was time. With a superhuman effort, I pushed my head and shoulders through the opening. The squeeze was tighter than I had imagined, even being so thin after 10 days without food. The rough bricks scratched my skin, but I didn't care. I pushed with my legs, painful inch by painful inch. For a terrifying moment, I was stuck, neither forward nor back, panic beginning to rise in my throat. Not now, I muttered to myself. Not after coming so far. With one last desperate effort, contorting my body in a way I didn't know was possible, I managed to get through. I fell onto the yard's ground, panting, trembling, but free. She's out. After 10 days of hell, she can feel the grass and see the stars. But this isn't the end of the story. It's the start of the reckoning. What she does next will change everything. For one brief moment, I just wanted to lie there forever, breathing in the fresh air I had longed for. But then I looked back at the house where the traitors were laughing over my pain, and that old fire inside me roared back to life. Freedom means nothing if justice isn't served. The cool night air had never been so sweet. I lay there for a few minutes, just breathing, feeling the damp grass on my body, looking at the first stars appearing in the sky. I was alive. I had won, but the victory was not yet complete. The final part of my plan was missing, the lesson I needed to teach. With difficulty, I dragged myself to the small building in the back of the property, my bakery. The door was locked, but I knew where the spare key was hidden, under a fern pot. My children never knew about this hiding spot. Inside the bakery, everything was as I had left it. The copper pots shining, the pans lined up, the jars of ingredients organized on the shelves. My sanctuary, my place of creation, where I had spent most of my life transforming sugar and fruits into small works of art. Now, it would be the place where I prepared my revenge. Not a deadly or violent revenge. I was never that type, but a lesson my children would never forget. Something worthy of the cruelty they had shown me. With trembling hands, but moved by an unshakable determination, I began to gather the ingredients I needed. I knew exactly what to do. In 10 days of hunger and despair in the dark basement, I had planned every detail. The dinner I would serve my children would be the most memorable I had ever prepared. Not for the delicious flavors, but for what it would represent. For the surprise on their faces when they saw that the mother they tried to kill was alive and serving dinner as if nothing had happened. As I worked, a faint smile formed on my skeletal face. They thought 10 days without food would be enough to bury me. Little did they know I would return to serve a dinner they would never forget. A dinner with a special ingredient for the 3 who had betrayed me. An ingredient that would not kill. I was not like them. But it would ensure they spent a few hours as uncomfortable as I had been for 10 days. Justice would be served on china plates, with silver cutlery, and a smile from someone who survived the worst and came back to tell the tale. I crawled through the hole I had made in the basement wall, like a snake shedding its skin. Except in my case, I was leaving behind not an old skin, but 10 days of hell. The opening was smaller than it looked, and my body, even consumed by hunger, still had trouble getting through. The rough bricks scratched my skin, tearing the dress that was already filthy after so many days. At one terrifying moment, I got stuck halfway, neither in nor out, and panic gripped my throat tighter than the bricks squeezed my waist. Not now, I muttered to myself, my voice more a breath than words. Not after getting so far. I took a deep breath, ignoring the pain in my ribs that felt like they wanted to pierce my skin, and twisted myself at an angle I didn't think possible at my age. With a final effort, I felt my body slide through the opening like a newborn. I landed on the yard floor with a dull thud, breathless, shaking like a leaf, but free. Free. I lay there for a few minutes, just feeling the damp earth beneath my body, the cool night air, the starry sky above. After 10 days in that dark, suffocating hole, even the smell of wet earth seemed like an expensive perfume. My legs barely obeyed me, too weak from the days without food. My arms trembled so much I had to prop my elbows on the ground to sit up. The world spun around me, and I had to close my eyes for a moment to keep from fainting. Any sensible person would have crawled to the street, asked the neighbors for help, gotten as far away as possible from the house that had almost become their tomb. But I hadn't survived to run away. I had survived to teach a lesson. I looked at the big house, where my ungrateful children were dining peacefully, probably celebrating the inheritance they would soon receive. The dining room lights were on, and I could hear the muffled sound of silverware and conversation. I also looked at the small building in the back of the property, my bakery, my sacred place, where I had built a life and a name. That's where I needed to go. With immense effort, I managed to get up, leaning on an old apple tree. My legs, thin as twigs after 10 days without food, could barely support my weight. Every step was a battle against dizziness, weakness, the pain that seemed to come from inside my bones. But every step was also a victory, an act of resistance, a resounding no to the death my children had planned for me. The small bakery was less than 100 feet from where I stood, but it seemed an impossible distance in my state. Still, I pushed forward, dragging my feet, stopping every few steps to catch my breath and wait for the world to stop spinning. I couldn't risk being seen from the house. If they discovered me now, all would be lost. Luckily, the dense foliage of the yard hid me, and they were too busy with their dinner to look out the window. When I finally reached the bakery door, I had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. The effort had been almost too much for my debilitated body. The door was locked, as I expected. My children probably thought they wouldn't need the keys anymore. After all, the owner of the business would soon be dead, and they would sell everything. But I had my secrets, small precautions learned over decades of living alone. I crouched with difficulty and stuck my hand under a fern pot next to the door. There it was, exactly where I always left it, a spare key wrapped in a piece of waxed cloth to protect it from moisture. Inside the bakery, the familiar smell of sugar and vanilla hit me like a wave, bringing tears to my eyes. It was the smell of my life, my work, my livelihood. The copper pots lined up on the shelves gleamed in the dim light, the molds organized by size, the ingredient jars labeled with my neat handwriting. Everything was as I had left it. At least that my children hadn't managed to destroy yet. I turned on only a small lamp in a corner to avoid attracting attention. The faint light was enough for what I needed to do. First, I went to the small mini-fridge I kept in the bakery and drank a full glass of clean, fresh water, an indescribable luxury after 10 days of drinking rusty water from the basement tap. Then I ate a handful of pecans I kept in a jar to use in my sweets. I knew I couldn't eat too much at once after so many days of forced fasting. My stomach would reject it, but I needed a little strength for what was to come. As I slowly chewed the pecans, my plan took its final form in my head. It wasn't enough just to survive. I needed them to feel a fraction of what they put me through. I needed to see the shock on their faces when they realized the mother they tried to kill was alive and right in front of them. And I needed to make sure they could never harm me or anyone else again. With hands still trembling but driven by an iron will, I began to gather the ingredients. I was going to prepare a full dinner, the most important dinner of my life. In the back of the bakery was a small stove I used to test new recipes. I also had a well-stocked pantry, as I bought ingredients in bulk to save money. Flour, sugar, butter, eggs, spices, everything I needed was there. As I worked, my mind wandered to the landline phone in the small room I used as an office. I could just call the police now, report my children, end it all at once. But something inside me wanted more than that. I wanted to look them in the eyes. I wanted them to see that I had survived their cruelty. I wanted to serve them not just the law's justice, but my own justice as well. The phone, of course, had been unplugged, but when I checked, I saw the line was still active. I first called my old friend and lawyer, Walter Evans. We had known each other for over 40 years, and he had handled all the legal matters for my family and my business. When he answered and heard my voice, he almost fainted on the other end of the line. "Charlotte, for the love of God, woman, where have you been? Your children said you'd gone to visit a sick cousin in Charlotte and hadn't been in touch for days." "Walter," I said, my voice still weak, "I don't have time to explain everything now. I need your help. My children tried to kill me." A heavy silence on the line. "What?" "They locked me in the basement for 10 days without food, only water. They wanted the house, the business, everything. They thought I would die down there, that no one would find out. My God." His voice failed him. He knew my children well. He had watched them grow up. "Do you have proof of this?" "I have my skeletal body. I have the scratches on my hands from trying to get out. I have the hole I made in the basement wall. And I will have their confession if you help me." I quickly explained my plan. He would listen to everything over the phone, which I would leave on during the confrontation. I also told him to call the police, who should arrive shortly after dinner began. Walter didn't like the idea much. He thought it was risky. He wanted me to leave the house immediately, but he knew me too well to try to dissuade me when I was determined. "All right, Charlotte. I'll call Sheriff Miller right now. He's a man I trust. But promise me you'll be careful. Those scoundrels have already shown what they're capable of. Don't worry, Walter. I survived 10 days in hell. I can handle another hour." After hanging up, I returned to preparing dinner. My hands worked almost on instinct, decades of experience guiding my movements even when my body was weak. I prepared fluffy rice with garlic, beans seasoned with bay leaf and bacon, a pot roast with potatoes, a Sunday specialty at our house, and a rich cornbread dressing with eggs and sausage. All family recipes, foods that had fed those ingrates their whole lives. But there was a special detail on the menu. In a locked cabinet, I kept special herbs and spices, some medicinal that I used occasionally in my sweets or to treat minor ailments. Among them, an herb known in the region as run for the hills root, a natural laxative so potent that old-timers said it made a person desperate to find a bathroom. I mixed a generous amount of this herb into the dishes that would be served to my children, but not in mine. The revenge would be humiliating, but not deadly. I was not like them. As the final dishes finished cooking, I found the strength to take a quick shower in the bakery's small bathroom. The water washed away some of the filth accumulated over 10 days in the basement, but it couldn't erase the marks the experience had left on me. In the cracked mirror above the sink, I saw a face I barely recognized. Sunken eyes, skin stretched over bones, tangled hair. I looked more like a ghost than a person. Perfect. It was exactly the effect I wanted to create. I put on one of the clean aprons I kept at the bakery, combed my hair as best I could, and prepared myself for the moment of truth. The clock on the wall read 7:40 p.m. Back at the house, they must be finishing their first course, waiting for the second round of food. The perfect time for my grand entrance. Carefully, I placed the prepared dishes on a large tray. My hands trembled from the effort and weakness, but determination gave me strength. I didn't know I still had. I left the phone on, with Walter on the line, listening to everything. In less than half an hour, he said, the police would arrive. Just enough time to serve my special dinner and see their reaction. The path from the bakery to the main house never seemed so long. Each step was a monumental effort, the tray weighing like lead in my weak arms. But I kept going, driven by a mixture of cold anger and relentless determination. I climbed the 3 steps of the back porch, which led directly to the kitchen. The door was unlocked. Of course, they had no reason to lock it, thinking I was slowly dying in the basement. I entered the kitchen silently. I could hear their voices coming from the dining room, chatting animatedly. I recognized Mark's loud laugh, Sarah's syrupy voice, even Ryan's hesitant tone. They were relaxed, comfortable, with no weight on their conscience for what they had done. The dining table was situated in an opening between the kitchen and the living room, allowing meals to be served directly. Perfect for my entrance. I took a deep breath, adjusted the tray in my arms, and took the final steps. I appeared in the dining room doorway like an apparition, a skeletal, elderly woman, pale as a corpse, but very much alive, carrying a tray of steaming food. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, as if someone had sucked all the air out of the space. "Dinner is served," I announced, my voice hoarse but firm, with 3 simple words. The balance of power shifts forever. She isn't just serving dinner. She's serving a cold, hard plate of justice they never saw coming. Stay with us, because the most unforgettable meal of their lives is about to begin. I hope you enjoy every bite, just as I enjoyed every moment of hunger thinking about this moment. The 3 of them froze in their chairs, their faces transforming into masks of horror and disbelief. Mark, always so controlled, dropped the fork he was holding. Sarah brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a scream. Ryan simply turned pale, looking like he was about to faint. For a sublime instant, no one said a word. They just stared at me, as if they were seeing a ghost. It was Mark who found his voice first, always the quickest thinker of the 3. "Mom? How are you? How did I get out of the basement where you locked me to die?" I completed, placing the tray on the table carefully. "With the same determination that your father and I had when we built this house from nothing, with the same strength that made me build a business from scratch, with the same stubbornness that has kept me alive for 81 years, despite everything." Sarah tried to stand up, but her legs seemed to disobey her. "We didn't. You don't understand. It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I repeated, calmly serving the plates in front of me. One for Mark, one for Sarah, one for Ryan. Each with its special portion of run for the hills root mixed into the food. "You locked me in a basement for 10 days without food, with only dirty water, waiting for me to die. What kind of misunderstanding would that be, daughter?" Ryan started to cry, his face in his hands. He was always the weakest, the one who let himself be led by the other 2. "It was Mark's idea," he sobbed. "I said it was wrong, that we shouldn't—" "Shut up, you idiot," Mark yelled, slamming his fist on the table. Then he turned to me, his eyes hard as stones. "Don't you understand? We just wanted what was best for everyone. This land is worth millions now. The house is too big for you alone. It was easier this way." "Easier to kill me?" I asked, sitting down at the table with them. My legs couldn't stand any longer. "Easier than waiting for me to die naturally. What a shame on you. The three of you." I raised snakes in my own bosom. "No one would have believed you," Sarah said, regaining some of her composure. The mask of the concerned daughter had fallen completely, revealing the cold, calculating woman I always knew existed beneath the surface, a confused old woman with memory lapses. Everyone was already commenting on how forgetful and disoriented you were. "Because you spread those rumors," I replied calmly. "Because you hid my medicine, moved things around, made me doubt my own sanity. I noticed everything. I just didn't want to believe that my own children would be capable of such cruelty." Mark stood up menacingly. He was a strong man, almost 6'3". I was a weak old woman, malnourished after 10 days of starvation. If he wanted to hurt me physically, I would have no way to defend myself. But I didn't back down an inch. "And now? What do you plan to do? Call the police? Who's going to believe this crazy story?" I smiled for the first time. A smile that didn't reach my eyes. "The police are already on their way, son. And as for proof, besides my obvious physical state, there's the hole I made in the basement wall, the marks of my nails on the door, and the phone that's on right now with my lawyer, listening to every word you say." Mark's face turned pale. He looked at his siblings, then at me, then at the plates of food I had served. For a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at me, but instead, he simply collapsed into his chair, seeming to deflate like a punctured balloon. "Eat," I said, gesturing to the plates. "The food is getting cold. It's the same recipe as always, the one you grew up eating. Perhaps the last good meal you'll have for a long time, before prison food." None of them moved. The atmosphere in the room was as heavy as lead, the air thick with tension and fear. Outside, I heard the distant sound of an approaching siren. Perfect. The police arriving at the exact moment as I had planned with Walter. "You know," I continued, now serving myself a little food from the separate pan, without the special ingredient. "For 10 days in that dark basement, the only thing that kept me alive was the thought that I needed to see justice done. Not for revenge, although I thought about that too, but so that you would learn that some betrayals have consequences, that you can't just discard a human life, much less your own mother's, as if it were trash." The sirens were closer now. The three of them looked at each other, panic growing on their faces. Ryan began to tremble visibly. Sarah looked towards the door, calculating if there was time to escape. Mark seemed to be in shock, unable to believe that his perfect plan had crumbled so completely. "One last thing before the police arrive," I added, pointing to their plates. "The food has a special ingredient for you three. Nothing lethal. I'm not a murderer like you, but I guarantee you'll spend the next few hours as uncomfortable as I spent the last 10 days. Consider it a small taste of the hell you tried to put me through." The exact moment I finished speaking, I heard tires screeching to a halt in front of the house, car doors slamming, authoritative voices shouting. The police had arrived. Mark's face twisted into a mask of hatred. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "It's not over yet." "Yes, it is, son," I replied with a calm I didn't feel. "For the three of you, it's over." The front door was thrown open violently, and several police officers entered, weapons drawn. Behind them, I recognized Sheriff Miller, a well-known figure in town, and my lawyer, Walter. When they saw me, their eyes widened in astonishment. My physical state, after 10 days in the basement, spoke for itself. "Mrs. Charlotte," exclaimed the sheriff, approaching quickly. "My God, you're alive." "Sheriff," I completed, despite my children's best efforts to change that fact. While the officers handcuffed the three, who offered no resistance, they were too shocked to do so, Walter came to me and held my hands in his. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known, Charlotte," he said with tears in his eyes. "But also the most stubborn. You could have died confronting them like this." "I almost died in that basement, Walter. What more did I have to lose?" It was at that moment that Mark began to feel the first effects of the run for the hills route. His face, already pale from shock, took on a greenish hue. He writhed, his handcuffed hands pressing against his stomach. "What? What did you put in the food?" he asked through clenched teeth. "Just a little poetic justice, son," I replied, watching as he was led away, practically doubled over in pain. Soon, Sarah and Ryan began to show the same symptoms. The three of them would be taken to the station, but they would probably make a stop at the bathroom first. Several stops, in fact. Because I thought a lot about this during those days in the basement. I could have just escaped, gone to the police station, filed a report, but something inside me needed them to see me, to personally face what they had done, to feel, even if in a mild way compared to what I went through, a little of the physical discomfort they imposed on me. Sheriff Miller insisted that I be taken to the hospital immediately. My condition was serious: severe malnutrition, dehydration, muscles atrophied from forced inactivity. The doctors later told me it was a miracle I had survived, especially at my age. "You have an impressive willpower," commented the doctor who treated me, Dr. Adams. "Many younger people would not have withstood such conditions. It wasn't willpower, it was pure stubbornness. As my Robert always used to say, stubbornness and a burning desire for justice. I was not going to leave this world leaving my children unpunished for what they had done. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of inheriting what Robert and I built with so much sweat. I was not going to allow my story to end locked in a dark basement, forgotten and erased." As the ambulance took me to the hospital, I looked out the window at my house receding in the distance, the house that almost became my tomb. I had survived. I had confronted my tormentors. I had ensured they would pay for their crimes. But the story didn't end there. There was still much to resolve, much rebuilding ahead. And I, Charlotte Williams, at 81 years old, after going through a hell few could imagine, was determined to live long enough to see complete justice served. I spent a whole week in the hospital. The doctors said they had never seen a case like mine. An 81-year-old woman surviving 10 days without food, with only water, and still having the strength to escape, prepare a dinner, and confront her captors. "You are a walking miracle, Mrs. Charlotte," said Dr. Adams, shaking his head as he checked my test results. It wasn't a miracle. It was pure Appalachian stubbornness, the kind that only comes from being born into hardship. The news spread through Asheville like wildfire through a dry field. "Famous baker locked in basement by her own children," the local papers said. The story was so absurd, so cruel, that no one wanted to believe it at first. But the evidence was irrefutable. My deplorable physical condition, the hole I made in the basement wall, the testimonies of witnesses who had noticed my sudden disappearance, and, most importantly, Ryan's confession. He broke down during the first interrogation and told them everything, trying to bargain for a lighter sentence. The three were held without bail. The charges were serious: attempted murder, false imprisonment, elder abuse, abandonment. Crimes that, added together, could result in more than 30 years in prison. Mark hired an expensive lawyer from Charlotte, the kind you see on television defending big shots. Sarah cried at the hearings, trying to win the judge's sympathy with her role as a repentant daughter. Ryan just kept his head down, accepting the blame with a resignation that almost made me feel sorry for him. When I was discharged from the hospital, I couldn't go back home. It had become a crime scene, sealed off for forensics. Besides, the thought of sleeping again within those walls that had witnessed such betrayal turned my stomach. My old friend Betty, owner of the diner on the corner, offered me shelter at her house. "Stay with me as long as you need, Charlotte. My house is small, but there's room for you." I accepted on the condition that I would help with expenses as soon as I could. I've never been one to accept charity, even in the most difficult times. The days that followed were ones of adaptation and recovery. My body, already battered by age, had suffered damage that would take time to heal. I lost almost 30 pounds in those 10 days, a luxury that I, being naturally thin, could not afford to lose. The doctors prescribed a special diet to recover lost nutrients, supplements, vitamins. Betty cared for me like a sister, preparing meals at the right times, reminding me to take my medications, accompanying me to doctor's appointments. But what impressed me most was the community's reaction. People I barely knew knocked on Betty's door, bringing food, medicine, gifts, words of support. Old customers from the bakery, families whose lives I had sweetened for decades with my recipes, came to visit me, often with tears in their eyes. "Mrs. Charlotte, you made my wedding cake," one would say. "You made the cupcakes for my boys' birthdays every year," another would say. It was as if all of Asheville felt they owed me a debt, and now it was time to repay it. My children's trial was swift by the standards of the American justice system. The evidence was too overwhelming for any effective defense. Mark's lawyer tried to argue that I suffered from dementia, that I had locked myself in the basement during an episode of mental confusion. This was demolished by the medical report attesting to my full sanity. He also tried to downplay the severity, saying they intended to release me after giving me a scare to get me to agree to the sale of the house. The judge didn't buy that story for a second. All three were convicted. The sound of the judge's gavel brings one kind of justice, the kind that locks doors and sets prison terms. But for a mother, the wounds of betrayal run deeper than any sentence. Now that the trial is over, Charlotte's true journey of recovery can begin. Mark received the heaviest sentence, 28 years in prison, for being considered the mastermind of the plan. Sarah received 22 years. Ryan, for having cooperated with the authorities and shown remorse, got 15 years with the possibility of parole after serving 1/5 of his sentence. I felt no joy seeing my children in handcuffs being led away to serve their sentences. Only a huge emptiness, a sense of waste. So many years of raising them, of sacrifice, of love, to end like this. After the trial, with the house released by the forensics team, I faced the difficult moment of returning there. Betty and Walter, my lawyer and friend, accompanied me. The place felt different, heavy with bad memories. Every corner echoed with the sound of betrayals. Every room held the ghost of a family that would never exist again. That first night back, I sat alone in the living room, and the silence was deafening. The house felt alien, hostile. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like their footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold their mocking smiles. For a terrifying hour, I considered selling it all, running away from the memories that threatened to drown me. But then, my gaze fell upon the portrait of Robert and me on our wedding day, his smile so full of hope. My mother's words echoed in my mind. "As long as you have your hands and your head on straight, you'll never be in need." This house wasn't their victory. It was my life's work. They would not take this from me. Not now, not ever. I would not just live here. I would make this house live again. This house was built with sweat and love, not betrayal. Every brick holds a memory of me and Robert. I won't let the ghosts of cruelty taint it. This is my home, not the grave they planned for me. I went into the basement only once, to see the hole I had made in the wall, my escape route, my path to freedom. Then I had that staircase sealed forever. That space would no longer exist in my house. I slept at Betty's house for 2 more weeks, while I gathered the courage to return to my home for good. When I finally did, it was with a decision made. I would not allow the trauma to define me. I would rebuild my life, my business, my purpose. The house my children wanted to turn into my tomb would become a symbol of resistance and rebirth. The first thing I did was reopen the bakery. It had been closed for almost 2 months, since my children started isolating me from the world. Many customers had found other suppliers, thinking I had retired or worse. But the news that Mrs. Charlotte Sweets was back spread quickly, and soon the orders started coming in. At first, there were few. A cake here, an order of sweets for a party there. But gradually, the clientele returned. It was on a Sunday afternoon, while I was preparing a batch of lemon meringue pies that would change everything. I was alone in the bakery, wondering how I would manage all the orders, when I heard a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Beatrice, a 7-year-old woman who lived 2 streets down from me. A widow like me, she lived alone in a simple little house. "I came to see if you need any help, Mrs. Charlotte," she said, a bit shyly. "I've always loved to bake. I learned from my grandmother back in Louisiana. If you'd like, I can lend a hand. I looked at Beatrice, her hands wrinkled but firm, her eyes lively despite her age, the dignified posture of someone who had faced life with courage. I saw in her a reflection of myself and thought of how many other Beatrices and Charlottes existed in Asheville. Elderly women with skills, willingness, and the need to feel useful. Women who, like me, ran the risk of being seen as burdens by their own families, as obstacles to be removed. "Come in, Beatrice," I replied, opening the door wider. "There's a lot to do, and 4 hands work better than 2. And just like that, a door opens to a new beginning. Charlotte isn't just reopening a bakery, she's building a sanctuary. This is how resilience becomes a legacy, turning a place of pain into a beacon of hope for women who refuse to be invisible. That was the beginning of the transformation. Within a few weeks, I had 5 ladies working with me in the bakery. Besides Beatrice, there was Helen, Joyce, Ruth, and Gloria, all between 65 and 80 years old, all with life stories marked by hardship and overcoming. Helen had raised 6 children alone after her husband died in an accident at the mill. Joyce had escaped an abusive marriage in the 72nd when that was almost unthinkable. Ruth had faced breast cancer twice. Gloria had lost her house in a flood and rebuilt everything from scratch, brick by brick. Strong women, like so many others in our city, in our country. Women who, upon reaching a certain age, were often pushed aside, seen as useless old ladies, burdens to the family, taking up space and consuming resources. Women who, like me, still had so much to offer if only someone gave them the opportunity. The bakery, which previously only produced for specific orders, now started making sweets to sell at farmers' markets, at events, in shops around the city. Each of us brought new recipes, different techniques, special touches, misses. Charlotte's Sweets transformed into the Grandma's Kitchen, a brand that soon gained fame, not just in Asheville, but throughout the western North Carolina region. It wasn't just a business, it was a form of resistance. Every sweet that left our hands was proof that we were not willing to disappear, to become invisible. Every party we sweetened was an affirmation of our presence, our relevance, our strength, and the community responded with enthusiasm. The orders kept pouring in, to the point where we had to hire 2 more ladies to keep up with the demand. With the growth of the business, I needed to make adaptations to the house. The small bakery in the back was expanded, getting new equipment, adequate space for more people to work. The front living room, which was once just for the family, was transformed into a small cafe where we served slices of cake, puddings, pies, and fresh coffee for anyone who wanted to sit and enjoy. The rooms that had belonged to my children were transformed. One became the office to manage the business. The other 2 became spaces for workshops and classes, because yes, we started offering baking workshops. At first, it was just for other ladies in the community. Then we expanded to anyone interested in learning. Young people, mothers wanting to make cakes for their children, teenagers looking for a profession, retired men looking for a hobby, tourists wanting to take a new skill home. Our classes were always full, with a waiting list. But I still felt something was missing. The terrible experience I went through had opened my eyes to a reality that is often hidden between the lines of the news, in the embarrassed silences of families, in the downcast eyes of the victims, elder abuse. Not just physical violence, like what I suffered, but also psychological, financial violence, abandonment, neglect. How many other Charlottes were suffering in silence at that very moment? How many would not be as lucky as I was to escape and report it? That's how the United Grandmas Project was born, a support network for elderly women in vulnerable situations. It started small, with weekly meetings in my living room where we talked about our rights, shared experiences, offered help to one another. Soon, the group grew so large that we needed to find a bigger space. The city, seeing the positive impact of the project, provided a room at the community center. We brought in lawyers to give free legal advice, social workers to help with benefits and retirement issues, psychologists for counseling victims of abuse. We created a hotline for anonymous reporting, a temporary shelter for elderly women who needed to leave their homes urgently, an emergency fund to help with medical expenses and basic needs. The project gained visibility beyond the borders of Asheville. Newspapers from Raleigh came to do stories, national television channels. I was invited to give talks in other cities, to speak with officials about public policies for the elderly. I, who had never left the state of North Carolina at 82 years old, was traveling across America, carrying my message, my story, my fight. I didn't do it for fame or recognition. I did it because every time a lady hugged me after a talk, crying and saying, "You saved me," I felt that all that pain had been worth it, that the hell I went through in the basement had a greater purpose than I could have ever imagined, that even the worst experiences can be transformed into something positive if we have the courage to use them, not to become bitter, but to help others. Amidst all this, there was still the issue of my children. It's not easy for a mother, no matter what has happened, to simply erase decades of love and care. In the first few months after the conviction, I refused to visit them in prison. The wound was too raw, the pain still too fresh. But over time, the anger gave way to a deep sadness, a mourning for all that we had lost, for all that could have been different. It was almost a year later that I received the first letter from Sarah. Unlike the previous messages she had sent through her lawyer, full of empty apologies and attempts to justify the unjustifiable, this one seemed sincere. She spoke of the regret she felt, not just for the act itself, but for a lifetime of resentments and wrong choices. She told me how therapy sessions in prison had made her see toxic patterns she had been repeating since her youth. She asked not for forgiveness. She said she had no right to it, but just for the chance one day to tell me in person how sorry she was. It took me weeks to reply. When I finally did, it was with few words. Forgiveness is not something granted all at once, daughter. It is a daily process, for both the one who forgives and the one who is forgiven. I am trying every day to find that path. We began a slow, cautious correspondence, full of silences and retreats. It wasn't easy for either of us. She was genuinely changing in prison, doing the internal work she should have done decades earlier. I was trying to separate the mother, who still loved her, from the victim, who almost died at her hands. 2 years after the conviction, I finally agreed to visit her. This might be Charlotte's most difficult journey yet, not through a brick wall but through the complicated maze of a mother's heart. Can a bond so violently broken ever be mended? Let's listen as she takes this brave, uncertain step toward the end of her story. Being a mother is a strange thing. Even when your heart's shattered into 100 pieces, there's still some small part of you that keeps asking, why? I didn't go there to forgive her. I went to search for a shard of the daughter I once loved, to see if she still existed somewhere inside that stranger. The meeting was difficult, fraught with conflicting emotions. She had aged a lot in prison. Her hair, once dyed, now showed all its white strands, her face marked by wrinkles that weren't there before. When she saw me, she cried like a child. I cried too, but silently, the tears streaming down my wrinkled face without making a sound. I don't know if I'll ever understand why you all did that, I told her when we could finally talk. But I want to try. I don't really understand either, Mom, she replied, her voice low. It was like we were different people in those days, consumed by greed, a blindness. Mark said it was the cleanest, quickest solution, that no one would suspect. And I let myself be carried along. I didn't have the courage to say no, to do the right thing. It wasn't a satisfactory explanation. It never would be. But it was a start, a recognition of her own weakness, her own moral failure. Over the following years, I continued to visit Sarah regularly. I can't say our relationship went back to what it was, it never could. But we built something new, something fragile and imperfect, but honest. Ryan also tried to reconnect a few years later. His shorter sentence allowed him to progress to a halfway house relatively early. He started working at a bakery during the day, returning to the facility at night. One Sunday, he appeared at my door, thin, aged, his eyes downcast with shame. "You have every right to send me away," he said, unable to look at me. "I just wanted you to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret what we did." I let him in. I offered him a coffee, The conversation was difficult, stilted, full of uncomfortable silences. But just like with Sarah, it was a beginning, a tenuous thread of possibility that, with time and a lot of work, could be strengthened. Mark was different. He never showed genuine remorse. The few letters he sent were full of self-justifications, veiled accusations, as if I were somehow to blame for what happened. I never replied. Some crimes are unforgivable. I don't know. I only know that forgiveness cannot be forced, cannot be faked. It has to come from within, as natural as breathing, and with Mark, that moment never came. As the years passed, the United Grandmas Project continued to grow, gaining strength, reaching more people. The small seed planted in Asheville bore fruit in other cities, with similar groups emerging in Raleigh, Greensboro, and even in Charlotte. We were now a statewide network with plans to expand across the country. The sweets business also prospered. Our baking grandmas numbered more than 20, all women over 60, many rescued from vulnerable situations through the project. Each one brought not only her culinary skills but her life story, her wisdom, her strength. Together we created not just delicious sweets, but a space of welcome, of appreciation, of respect. A few years later, at the age of 83, I received an honor I never imagined, the title of Esteemed Citizen of Asheville, awarded by the City Council. The ceremony was at the Municipal Theater, packed with people who had been touched in some way by the work we were doing. When I went up on stage to receive the diploma, leaning on the cane I now used for longer distances, I saw in everyone's eyes there not pity, not condescension, but genuine admiration and respect. "You are an example to us all," said the mayor. "Proof that it is never too late to start over, to turn pain into purpose, to leave a legacy." In my brief acceptance speech, I spoke about the lessons life had taught me, especially in recent years. The hunger of the body can be terrible, but the hunger for power and money destroys entire souls. I learned that our strength comes not from what we have, but from what we endure. That the worst experiences can become our greatest teachers if we have the courage to face them not as endings, but as beginnings. That we should never, ever allow others to define our worth or limit our possibilities. No matter our age, our gender, our condition. Looking back on the path I've traveled since those 10 days in the basement, I feel a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for what I lost. The family I knew, the innocent trust I had, the security I felt in my own home. But also gratitude for what I gained. A purpose greater than myself. A community of extraordinary women. The certainty that my life and my story are serving to protect and inspire others. They locked me up, thinking I would wither away alone in the dark. They didn't know that for 81 years, I had already survived worse things, and that from darkness, one can also make light. They didn't know that the hands that made sweets had enough strength to break through walls. They didn't know that the heart they thought they could stop had beaten too strongly, for too long, to simply give up. Today, when people ask me how I endured those 10 days, how I survived the hunger, the darkness, the betrayal, I always answer the same thing. One day at a time, 1 minute at a time, one breath at a time. There is no other secret to survival, whether in a dark basement or in life outside. We keep going, one step after another, even when it seems impossible, even when everything in us wants to give up. And if there is one message I would like to leave for anyone reading or listening to this story, it is this: never underestimate the strength of an elderly woman. We who have made it this far, who have survived decades of challenges, of losses, of new beginnings, carry within us a resilience you can hardly imagine. Our wrinkles are maps of battles won. Our hands, even when trembling, can still build and transform. Our voices, even when weakened by time, still deserve to be heard. My name is Charlotte Williams. I'm now 83 years old, and this is the story of how I survived the hunger and betrayal of those I loved most. My story is proof that even in the darkest, most hopeless places, just a spark of hope and a little bit of courage can be enough to find the way out. If my journey has touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder. They are so much stronger than they think. Leave a comment below and tell me about a moment when you found strength you didn't know you had. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. the grandma's kitchen, where we serve up more than just rich, flavorful recipes. We share life stories of resilience, of rising after the fall, and of new beginnings at any age. Because when we truly listen to one another, together, we make sure no voice is left behind, even the ones that tremble with age. And please remember, never underestimate the power of a white-haired woman.